2001 Mercury Sable with just over 100,000 miles on it, obviously driven by a little old lady, a 70-year-old kind of fireball lady, and the car will not go over 25 miles an hour. And it's not because the old lady's driving it, by the way. If you met her, trust me, you would eliminate that as the problem right away. The car definitely has a power problem. It has very, very low power. And I also duplicated this myself. The best way I can describe it, it feels like the car is towing a 50,000-pound sled without wheels. The engine actually seems to run fine. There's no misfires, no surging, no hesitations, things like that. It just feels like the car is really, really struggling mightily. The car also makes kind of a sort of a loud hissing noise, almost like a vacuum leak, but it's not. But very, very underpowered. Now I know what it must feel like to drive a Honda Civic with a 5-inch exhaust tip, I guess. But anyway, I'm going to go in the direction of an exhaust restriction. I've never seen an exhaust restriction before. This will be the first one, I'm pretty confident. So I'm a little excited to look at that. But I do believe that's what the problem is going to be. But this car has a very disturbing repair history before it got to me. With these symptoms, another symptom, by the way, the car won't go over 2,500 RPM either. And so the lady brings the car to a shop, and we've got all kinds of new parts on this car. That kind of helps with the diagnosis, actually. The first shop she brought it to, what do you think they changed? Of course, plugs and wires every time. And that didn't fix it. After the plugs and wires, what do you think they changed next? Well, you would think oxygen sensors, of course, but not this time. They replaced the mass airflow sensor, and that didn't fix it. Frustrated and out several $100s, the lady takes it to another shop where they promptly diagnose a faulty throttle position sensor, which of course doesn't fix it. Then they replace the idle air control valve, which doesn't fix it. Frustrated and running out of money, the lady now brings it to a mobile mechanic. Well, actually, I guess the mobile mechanic comes to her, right? Somebody she found on Craigslist because he was really cheap. He immediately diagnoses a faulty EGR valve stuck open, causing the problem, which of course doesn't fix it. He then diagnoses a leaking intake manifold gasket, apparently the upper intake manifold, and replaces that, cracks the intake manifold in the process, and then has to go get another intake manifold and gasket, at which point he disappears from sight completely for 2 weeks, leaving the key on in the ignition, killing the battery, so there's no check engine codes or anything. There was a check engine light, by the way. He never read it, so I don't know what to say about that. The lady can't get hold of the mechanic. Frustrated, she puts an all-points bulletin out to her church congregation asking if anybody knows of a mechanic that can help her out. By karma, one of the congregation members is a regular customer of mine, hooked me up with her. I went out to visit. Not much I can do because I've got a cracked intake manifold. Guess who shows up? Totally serendipitously while I'm looking at the car. That asshat mechanic who immediately cross-threaded with me when he replaces the intake manifold gasket and the new plenum, and of course the car still doesn't work. And he promptly diagnoses oxygen sensor problem, which my scan tool shows that that's not it. He then diagnoses, get this, a frozen piston, whatever that means, at number 2, so which is right in the front of the engine. Quickly dismissed with a very quick compression test that I did, and he goes on to point out that I'm not a real mechanic and not ASC certified and didn't go through training, and he's got 10 years, and yeah, we didn't get along very well. So I told the old lady if she brings the car to me, I will give her a free, accurate diagnosis, and if I tell her she needs a part, I will buy the part for her if I am wrong. So I've got to be right because I think I'm going to end up diagnosing an exhaust system on this. But that's where we're at. So let's go ahead and give you a listen to the car, and then what I want to do is come up with an approach, because I can't be wrong on this or I'm going to be spending a lot of money on an exhaust system that this woman doesn't need if I misdiagnose it. But I'm pretty confident we're going to have a restricted exhaust, and I'm going to come up with a methodological system to conclusively prove once and for all that is what is wrong with this car, and I think it's going to be pretty easy. All right, again, that sound that you heard, that sounded like an intake leak. I can tell you that from under the car, that is actually the sound of air pushing past the flanges of the exhaust. You can actually also hear and feel it at the EGR valve on the top of the engine. Restricted exhaust, right? But remember, I promised this lady this is the last time she's going to have parts put on this car. I have to be 100% certain. Maybe there's an exhaust restriction. And another problem, it's reasonable, by the way, that with only 100,000 miles, maybe there is some type of rich problem with the car that's causing the catalytic converter to melt. So the clogged catalytic converter is the immediate problem, but there may be a more long-term problem. But I am going to have to pay for the repair if I'm wrong on this diagnosis, so I'm going to be very thorough. These are some things that I listed. There's probably more, but I'm so confident that this is an exhaust restriction that I'm not going to really test all of these per se, but I am going to eliminate them. So one of the things that can cause low power problems is a mechanical impedance. The parking brake stuck closed, for example, or pinched, the rotors are jammed closed or something. The brakes are jammed closed on the rotors. That is not a problem here. You can test that very easily. Jack up the car, spin the wheels, they'll spin freely. I know this isn't a problem because if the car is put in neutral and it goes down a hill, it picks up speed instead of slowing down, which would be indicative of impedance. So I'm not worried about that. Another possibility, it could be a transmission problem that doesn't let it go faster. Two reasons I know that's not it. One of them is I'm very familiar with the limp mode on Chrysler vehicles. Limp mode is sort of a safety feature. If the engine detects a shifting problem, a serious mechanical problem, what it'll do a lot of times, especially if it detects a slip or missed shift or something with the transmission, it'll lock the transmission into second gear. It's called limp mode. You're going to get a check engine light with this, which of course we didn't get, and the car won't go above 40 miles an hour because it's stuck in second gear. The reason I know this is not a transmission issue is twofold. First of all, the transmission does shift from first to second, and at one point, as the old lady said, when she drove it down a hill, she actually did get the car up to 40 and she felt it shift, and she said it was the most excitement she had in her car in a month. That's too bad. But the other reason I know it's not a transmission issue is even if you put it into neutral, the engine still won't rev over 2,500 RPM. So transmission eliminated. Misfire or ignition, I did put a scan tool up to it. There are no misfires or anything like that. Incidentally, that asshat mobile mechanic wanted to put a coil on it, which we got in a little argument when I asked him why there are no misfires if there's a coil problem. But anyway, I hope he watches this video. I really do. The other one could be an air intake restriction, and that is not an issue. There is nothing up. Remember, it's got a new throttle body, for God's sakes. The air filter is clean. There's nothing from the air filter through the MAF to the throttle body. New throttle body. Good God. All right. An engine mechanical problem, something like the bearing clearance is too tight, a spun bearing, something like that. Possible, the way to test that, and I did, by the way, is to turn the crankshaft over by hand and see if it's really impossible to turn the engine. Something like a jammed accessory and the belt is tied up could do that. I did actually remove the serpentine belt, and as you probably know, I'm terrible with diagnosing engine noises. That vacuum hiss sound I thought might possibly be a bad alternator or something, so I actually removed the serpentine belt to see if the sound continued. It did, so I know it's not an accessory issue or anything, but it is worth ruling out a mechanical engine binding issue, which is not the case here. The next one we've got is fuel, which is going to be really easy to test here. This vehicle has a Schrader valve right at the very top of the engine, so I can put a fuel pressure gauge on it. Also, just for my own curiosity, because I love the scan tool, I want to put a scan tool up to it and see if there's anything I can see on the scan tool that might help diagnose a exhaust problem. I do not believe this is going to be a fuel problem, but we're going to rule it out. And at the very end, I did put the restricted exhaust, which I believe it's going to be. I am going to test that a couple ways. Yeah, excuse me for my voice. I kind of have a cold coming on or something, but there's a couple ways to test that, which I really don't have a good way of doing it. The real way I'd like to do it is with a back pressure test, but I don't have an exhaust back pressure kit. But I do have a vacuum gauge, and I've got some old oxygen sensors. And what I'm thinking of doing is drilling the guts out of an oxygen sensor to hollow it out, see if I can hook the vacuum gauge up to it, because it's also a pressure gauge, and see if I can measure back pressure with a little fabricated thing that way. The other way that I can do it, if that doesn't work out, I can disconnect the exhaust after the catalytic converter, and if the problem improves, then I know we've got a clogged muffler or pipes up to the muffler. If that doesn't help, I can disconnect the exhaust before the catalytic converter, and if the engine bumps up in RPM and runs fine, then I know that that's an catalytic converter restriction, which I believe it probably is. The only problem with that, that's going to make the car sound really loud because I'm opening the exhaust before the muffler either way. So I'd really like to do the back pressure test because it'll be a lot quieter, and I'm in my house, in my neighborhood, and I don't want to disturb my neighbors too much. So that's kind of the plan where I'm going at. So let's go ahead and do the fuel thing, and also, just for curiosity, see what this looks like on a scan tool.
All right, sorry for talking over the engine here. It's I don't understand how anybody could miss this sound. But what I'm looking at is some engine RPM, making sure I'm in closed loop, looking at fuel status. Now I've got a problem here in that my O2 sensors are reading flat, so there may be some issue with the oxygen sensors, but unfortunately I'm going to have to do this after I fix this problem. So I'm not going to be able to do scan tool data, but I will go ahead and do fuel pressure.
Wow, it is amazing to me that anybody would just overlook, actually all those people would just overlook that sound and not investigate that. But let's go ahead and check the fuel pressure real quick, and let's go ahead and start it and see if the fuel pressure keeps up with the demand. Okay, that safely rules out fuel pressure right there. So let's move on to the clogged exhaust. All right, it's time to quit messing around here. So what I'm going to do is use this vacuum gauge and try to configure some type of exhaust back pressure gauge out of it by manipulating a old oxygen sensor and getting it to fit into the bunghole in the bunghole. Bunghole. I need a gauge for my bunghole. Sorry, but go ahead and see if I can fit this into the oxygen sensor hole and measure pressure. At least this, yeah, this does have pressure on it. So, and actually, as a matter of fact, I don't use vacuum gauges. I can count on one hand the number of times I've ever used this, but I remember seeing in the directions that you can test for exhaust backups using a vacuum gauge. Maybe that's worth a try, especially since we couldn't do the scan tool thing. Let's go ahead and try that and see what happens. All right, so it says here, exhaust restriction test with vacuum gauge connected to a manifold vacuum, increase engine speed to 2,000 RPM, maintain the speed, note the reading, a gradually decreasing vacuum may indicate a restricted exhaust. All right, well, we'll go ahead and try that. In my opinion, this vacuum gauge is the most subjective diagnostic tool I have in my entire garage. It's certainly far from my favorite, but it may just point some more evidence towards what we already think we have. So let's go ahead and do this. All right, we can see we're already starting off with really low vacuum. Maybe my gauge isn't sealed up all the way, but the engine's about ready to die, so maybe I do have a little bit of a leak. But let's just see if we increase the vacuum with engine speed. I'm pretty sure I don't have a good seal with my gauge. I didn't have the right hose. Well, the vacuum definitely drops, and actually I almost burned my hand with the exhaust gases that are coming out of the EGR valve, which is right next to the throttle. So it's actually really hot. Definitely that's an exhaust back pressure, but it does appear that the vacuum does drop, doesn't it? That's pretty interesting. Ouch. Yeah, that exhaust gas is really hot coming from that EGR valve gasket. So I think we're done with this one. Well, I must admit, that is the first time ever, well, out of the 4 times that I've ever used that vacuum gauge, that it actually has shown to reflect what I expected to see. So that's kind of cool. But I certainly think there's other things that could explain it. I don't, you know, this wasn't a big deal for me, so I think the gauge might have been leaking a little bit. I wouldn't expect an engine to run at perfect 0 vacuum like that. So not a perfect test, but the bottom line is it did indeed drop vacuum when I accelerated, as indicated. So this, however, is going to be the final test, and this is going to basically put an end to this. So I found a piece of pipe right here, so I don't have to modify an old oxygen sensor, and the thread on the pipe just happens to be the same as an oxygen sensor. And I'm going to thread the pipe with this hose in here, hook up my vacuum, well, soon to be back pressure gauge, and on a good running engine, there should be almost no back pressure. It's possible that the hose may pop right off the tool, in which case that's fine. If the hose pops off the tool, that's enough back pressure that we're done, and that verifies 100% an exhaust restriction. But we're going to see if we can read the back pressure on the gauge. I'm expecting to see no back pressure on a good system. On a system like this, anything over 2 psi, we're done, exhaust restriction, and I'll bet it's going to be higher than that. So let's go ahead and set this up and see how it works. Okay, so I'm going to get the oxygen sensor out. And then I'm going to thread in my special tool here. Okay, I think we are done here. Okay, that works beautifully. We are done. That is definitely an exhaust restriction. Oh, sweet. I love it when stuff works like that. That worked way better than expected. So that 100% guarantees that this is indeed an exhaust restriction. I feel very confident with telling that to the customer. The question now is, where is the restriction? Most likely, I would imagine, the catalytic converter. So what I can do is repeat this test after the catalytic converter and see if the back pressure is low at that point. If the back pressure is low after the catalytic converter is the problem. If the back pressure is still high, though, well, then we've got a muffler clog or some clog in the pipe up to the muffler. But that's insignificant at this point. Maybe I'll go ahead and do that and just let you know, just for your own curiosity. But that should conclude the video. That is how to do an exhaust back pressure test. So I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching.